Hi, I'm Rachel, a resource expert and career coach for museum educators who are stretched thin but long to fall in love with their world-changing work. After over 15 years with my own hands in the glitter, I know how it feels when your board thinks your work is childish because you work with children. I know how hard it is to lead a tour on a difficult subject, and I know the frustration of waiting on a school bus that is 20 minutes late. Or worse, 10 minutes early. As I'm heading towards the second half of my career, I find myself with a passion to help my fellow educators reverse the chronic state of being overworked and underappreciated so that they can reclaim their creativity and emotional energy. Join me and my museum buddies as we share our best tips, tricks, and techniques for modern museum education. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the 12 Days of Christmas Modern Museum Education Edition, my holiday gift to the museum educator community. For the next several days, I'll be releasing bite-sized podcast episodes stuffed with actionable tips and, as always, grounded in current research to help you level up your museum education programs. Today I have something that's a little less actionable and just a little bit more general information. It's something that I have been diving into a little bit recently for some of my projects for the coursework that I'm doing in my PhD, and I just found it really interesting, and I thought maybe you would find it interesting too. And it's quite possible that I find it especially interesting because I am a historian by nature, and then, I came into museum education from the perspective of public history, so I find history incredibly exciting. And maybe you do too. If not, that's all right. You can skip this episode and, I'll be back again tomorrow. But I do think there's something really important about understanding the history of your own profession. And I think that as museum educators, especially as we're looking towards the next several years and what might be coming down the pike in terms of changes in administration and the upcoming sesquicentennial and all these things that are going to be sort of swirling around in our professional lives over the next few years, I think there's value in being grounded in what has come before. So especially if you are inclined toward advocacy work, or if you want to know more about museum advocacy, I think it's really important that you understand the foundations of museum policy in the United States. And so I wanted to give you kind of a really brief, super quick look at the relationship between the museum industry and policymaking in the United States. Okay, so to start at the beginning, the very first time that the federal government made any kind of policy statement in regards to the museum industry was the founding of the Smithsonian, and that happened in 1846. And the founding of the Smithsonian is so interesting. If you don't know how the Smithsonian came to be, it is worth a look into the history books. So basically what happened was that in the 1820s, a British scientist named James Smithson died, and his estate was left to his nephew. But in his will, he specified that should his nephew die without an heir, then their sizable estate should be given to the people of the United States for the diffusion of knowledge, essentially to create an institution. And he specifically named in the will that it should be called the Smithsonian after himself. And it should be this institution that is designed to create and disseminate knowledge to the people. But what's so fascinating is that this man, James Smithson, had, number one, never visited the United States. To anyone's knowledge, he never came here at all. And number two, there was no motivation in the will. Nothing was stated as to what motivated him to give this money to the United States. And there's all this speculation. Was it because, did he have this really noble view of democracy, or was he spicy because he was an illegitimate son and he'd never got the best of British society, or what was happening here? There's a lot of sort of theories, but anyhow, he donates this money, or, in his will, he sets out for the money to be donated to the United States. A few years later, his nephew does die without an heir. And at that point, the money is then available for the United States to take. But the United States government did not just take it at first. There was a lot of debate in Congress about whether or not they could accept this bequest in order to understand why Congress was feeling this conflict. And this has to do with what happens later in policy related to the museum field, it's important to remember that the United States is a federalist system. So what that means is the federal government has some authority over some things, but they defer, intentionally so. They defer a lot of authority to the states, and then states defer a lot of authority to cities and to counties and municipal governments. And this is all by design so that the power in our country is not centrally located in one place. So in the 1840s, there's debate about whether or not the federal government even had the authority to create a national institution. So that was the first debate, whether or not they even had this authority. Ultimately, they decided that they did have that authority, they would accept the money, and they established the Smithsonian Institution. Interestingly enough, the will did not specify that it had to be a museum. There were, at first, a lot of people assumed it would be a university. And there was a lot of, a network of congressmen and scientists and educators and other people who were stakeholders in this. They kind of decided together that the best use of this money was to create a research institution, and that included a museum. The laws that govern the Smithsonian directly don't apply to the governance of most museums in the country. It does set a precedent for this sort of ambivalent relationship that the federal government has with the museum field, and it sort of embodies the ambivalence that the federal government also has towards cultural heritage policy. Cultural heritage policy is not centralized in the United States either. So moving on from that point, for much of the following century, museums operated pretty independently of federal oversight and really relied specifically on local support, particularly philanthropists. This is when you start to see in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Gilded Age museums becoming the norm, where museums are funded by very wealthy philanthropists. But that fundamentally changed in the middle of the 20th century. So following World War II, for the next 20 years, between the 1950s to the 1970s, you have just an onslaught of cultural change. There were multiple wars, hot wars and cold wars. There were multiple social revolutions, civil rights movements. There's all kinds of things happening in this time. And all of that is butting up against the oncoming bicentennial in 1976. So there was a lot of conversation about what it meant to be American, what it meant to, what American culture was, heritage, civics, all of these things were sort of swirling around. So in the field and in the government, people were talking about the subject. But museums themselves were kind of under a microscope by the 1970s, because in the post-World War II era, there was a rise in road culture, American road culture, and tourism. And this is where, if you aren't aware that Mickey Mouse and Disneyland had a huge impact on the American museum industry, maybe we should do a podcast episode on this too. This is also really, really fascinating. But just to hit the highlights, essentially, in the post-World War II period, there was a rise in leisure tourism. And that did two things. One, it created a market for tourism. And all of a sudden, museums across the country were just inundated with visitors in a way that they never had been before. And at the same time, museums across the country found themselves in competition with each other and with other leisure destinations like Disneyland or other amusement parks. So it's against this backdrop that a couple of really important things, policy related, happen for the museum field. The first thing is that in 1965, the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act was passed, and that is what created the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts, which are two of the largest public funding sources for museums today. So that was established in 1965. But just a couple of years later, President Johnson commissioned a groundbreaking study on the state of museums in America. And the name of that report that was commissioned by Johnson was actually published by AAM, which at the time was called the American Association of Museums. Now, of course, it's the American Alliance. But the time it was the American Association of Museums, AAM, they published a report. It was called America's Museums, the Belmont Report. So the Belmont Report paints this picture of museums as having recently experienced unpredicted popular success, but that they were struggling to keep up with their own audiences, and they couldn't afford it anymore. So the Belmont Report made a very strong case for two really important things that we still advocate for in the museum field. Number one, the Belmont Report was foundational because it was the first official government document that drew a specific through line between museums and public education. This is the first place where you have, in any kind of official capacity, museums being described as a educational support for public education. And the second thing the Belmont Report did was that it made a really strong case for public federal support of museums. Now, there were critics, of course, who argued that museum funding ought to remain a state issue. And some people also questioned the motivations behind the report because this report came out in 1969. There was a Tax Reform Act that same year that changed the classification of museums to be educational institutions so that if you gave money to a museum, you could get the same tax breaks as if you gave money to a school or to a library. And so some people questioned the motivation of the report. But ultimately, that report is a really just super, super important part of our history and the history, like the foundational history of museum advocacy. So building on the momentum from the Belmont Report, Congress began passing legislation, or introducing and then eventually passing legislation in support of museums. So in 1974, 1975, there were several bills that were put. There was a Senate bill, there was a House bill. None of them kind of went through until 1976. The Arts, Humanities, and Cultural Affairs Act was signed into law. And that included something called the Museum Services Act. And the Museum Services Act created the very first Institute of Museum Services, and it was an avenue for funding and support for museums. Now, even at the time, in the 1970s, museum professionals recognized the MSA as a double-edged sword. So it definitely brought much needed funding, but if you go back and look at op-eds that were coming out in like the Journal of Museum Education, which was at the time called Roundtable Reports, and some other publications like that, museum professionals were a little hesitant, afraid that perhaps accepting federal funding might, over time, weaken the independence and agency of museums to make their own content and interpretation decisions. And I think that that's a really important point as we're looking towards continued funding into the 21st century, how many strings, right, come attached to the public funding that we rely on. So not that it's good or bad in either way, but it's important as advocates for us to understand that there are pros and cons in both directions, right? So moving on, fast forward like 20 years. In 1996, the original Museum Services Act evolves into the Museum and Library Services Act. And that is where IMLS comes from. And essentially, high level, what happened is that there was legislation that supported museums and legislation that supported libraries, and they rolled all of that together into the Museum and Library Services Act to create IMLS, the Institute for Museum and Library Services. And so since that time in 1996, the law has been reauthorized. Essentially, it's been passed again and again a couple of times, once in 2003, once in 2010, and then most recently in 2018. And then that 2018 law funds IMLS through the end of fiscal year 2025. So I say all that to say, this conversation is going to happen again very soon at a federal level. So don't be caught off guard when you start hearing advocates talk about IMLS funding and the role that museums play in society. Because in all of these moments, in 1846, in 1976, in 1996, in 2018, it's going to happen again this coming year. In all of these time periods, the same argument comes up. There's two arguments. One is Is funding museums a federal responsibility or is it a state responsibility? And the second question that is talked about is, if museums take federal money, how much agency are they giving away? And both of these questions are really important for us to ponder and think about. Museum funding is what is called a wicked problem. And in a later podcast episode in this 12 days series, I'm going to talk about wicked problems in terms of systems thinking for museums, but I'll just briefly introduce it right here. A wicked problem, if you don't know that term, essentially is a problem that has no solution. It's a problem that cannot be solved. It is a problem that can only be addressed, and then a solution is iterated on, but a final solution is never going to come. And I think that museum funding is a wicked problem because no matter where your funding comes from, whether it's public or private, there's always strings attached. Think, for example, about the Sackler money that funded numerous very high-profile museum galleries. And then, of course, the scandal that came out with the opioid crisis and all of those museums and universities too having to make a decision about whether they were going to take the Sackler name off of their buildings. So private funding comes with strings attached as well. So essentially, the history of museum policy advocacy in the United States tells a compelling story of this tension between power and public, this tension between state authority and federal authority. So for the most part in the United States, federal funding is available, but while you can get direct funding like from IMLS, a lot of times federal funding is filtered through state-level organizations. For example, National Endowment for the Humanities funding often comes down to museums via their own state humanities council. So I'm in Tennessee, so Humanities Tennessee is who I would work with if I was working with the Tennessee Museum. But there's humanities councils for every state, and they help administer all of the NEH funding that is available. So there is definitely a relationship between federal funding, state organizations, city governance, and independent museums. And it's important that as we're talking about advocacy, we understand the interplay between all of these actors. The other thing I think it's really important if you're talking about advocacy is to understand that there's always been ambivalence at the federal level about the federal government's role and responsibility in cultural heritage preservation, in cultural heritage funding, and in the museum field in general. And then also, I think it's really important that you understand where some of our foundational arguments come from. We often argue that federal funding is a necessity for museums, and we often argue that museums do support public education. And those two arguments are grounded in a very specific primary source document. It comes from 1969. And obviously there's a lot of research that supports that argument between museums and education. And I cite a lot of it all of the time. But it's important that we understand that from an advocacy and from a policy standpoint, where does this viewpoint start? Where is it grounded? And it's grounded in 1969. It doesn't really, from a federal level and from a policy level, it doesn't predate 1969. Obviously, there are examples that predate 1969, early examples of field trips that date all the way back to the 1870s. But from a policy standpoint, that line of thought that museums support public education and that museums should be federally funded, that doesn't even exist in the policy sphere until 1969. So it's relatively recent in terms of policy history. And I think it's just really important that we understand that. Okay, so there's the only really actionable takeaway here from this episode is maybe if you're interested in policy or if you're interested in advocacy, to do a little research and get ready. Advocacy Day is coming up in February with AAM, and maybe look into your state museum association. Do they have advocacy days? Do they have advocacy work that they're pushing? Find out who your legislators are, because they're going to need to hear from you when IMLS funding reaches the end of its authorization, which is coming up sooner rather than later. So, be prepared. If advocacy is of interest to you, get prepared, because now is the time to start getting your information together and getting your thoughts together so that you know what it is you think museums ought to do, what they ought to be in the world, and what support they ought to receive publicly and or privately. So with that said, I'm going to wrap this episode up, and I'll be back tomorrow with another of the 12 Days of Christmas. Thank you so much for joining us. If this episode has been helpful to you or interesting, please take a minute to like, subscribe, and leave a review, which will help other museum educators find this resource. As always, if you would like to work with me more directly, have any questions, or would like to be a guest on the podcast, you can find links to all that and more on my website, modernmuseumeducation.com. I'll see you back here next time, and in the meantime, please remember that your work is not childish just because you work with children.